So today we're going to be talking about information economics. So this is just looking at the economy or looking at microeconomics through the prism of the role of information and how important information can be. So information is important to both sides of any market. It's important to the consumer and it's important to the producer, but it plays a little bit differently on depending on which side of the market we're talking about. So for the consumer, information clearly provides some detail. It provides some important notifications about what you're looking to buy, because it tells you about things like prices and quality of a product. It tells you about attributes of the product. It tells you about the different characteristics. It tells you about the different variations of the product. And it can clearly change the purchasing behavior of consumers. As we will talk about later, this is one of the reasons why firms invest so much in advertising, trying to provide information about products to consumers. This is, though, not part of every different market structure. We've looked at 4 different market structures: monopoly, competition, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. And we're not going to see the spreading of information occur to the same degree in each one of those different market structures. It's a defining characteristic of certain market structures. Now, if consumers have perfect information on prices and on the quality of products, they can shop around. This is one of the characteristics of competition. Remember, we say that in competitive markets, individual consumers have all of the information they need to find the product at a particular price. And they know that if somebody tries to raise the price, if a seller says, I'm going to sell it a little bit higher, they know that the price of the same exact product is lower elsewhere, and they know exactly where to get it. In competition, we say that consumers have perfect information. Now that may be a little bit unrealistic, but that's one of the categories, one of the assumptions of that particular model. If we look at information from a more realistic perspective, we know that information is limited. Information is good. It can help us make better decisions, and it can help us save money. It can help us in a lot of different ways in an economic transaction, but information is limited. Additionally, not all information is reliable. So we know this is the case with the internet. We almost joke about this. Oh, it's been on the internet, it must be true. And we kind of chuckle a little bit. And we say, during an election, people get their information from Facebook, and we kind of shake our heads and ask, why are you doing that? Because we know not all information is reliable. There's lots of information out there, but we don't know for sure whether it's actually going to be good information or not. Additionally, information is costly to acquire. Just think about trying to find a college and trying to find the perfect college and gather all of the information you need to make that choice. Whether it's through college visits, whether it's through talking with faculty, whether it's talking with admissions and finding out about financial aid and finding about the food and the weather on the campus and how often do they shovel the walks if it snows. And there's just so much information to make a perfect choice, but that's costly to acquire. So oftentimes we say that people are rationally ignorant. And what that means is that there's a point at which adding more information to your database of making a decision is just too costly. So we don't become perfectly informed when it comes to making a choice. We are rationally ignorant, because it's rational to remain ignorant if we weigh the costs and the benefits of collecting more information. Sometimes, though, we think of ways that consumers can be limited by having too much information. Some people are just not smart enough to process all the information that they've collected. And so they collect information, but they only collect a little bit of information. They say that, you know what, this is good enough. And that's just a feature of people. Sometimes people just can't process too much information. And we might think of them as dumb, or maybe they're incredibly rationally ignorant. But it could be that they have limited mental facilities to put together all the information they have at their disposal. As a result of this, we see that people sometimes take these rules of thumb, these kind of generally accepted beliefs about things, and they make that part of their information gathering and their decision-making processes, even if the rules of thumb aren't always 100% correct. There are generally accepted things that people rely upon to make decisions. The idea that Germans make better cars than Americans, that's a rule of thumb, which isn't true, but it's something that people say, oh, if you have a Mercedes versus a Ford, it must be a better car. Maybe sometimes yes and sometimes no. Or the idea that women are worse drivers than men. That's what some people think, and they say, oh, if I get cut off in traffic, it must be a woman driver. Well, that's not true. Not always, anyway. It's a rule of thumb. It's something that we think is generally true most of the time. And when you use those things to make decisions, sometimes it helps to speed the decision-making process when, other times it's just plain incorrect. Another thing about making decisions and the trying to process information is that sometimes even really smart people are incapable of processing certain kinds of information, even if they have it. Sometimes even really, really smart people make really bad decisions because there's something about them in particular, those people, who just can't process certain types of information. Now, here's a rule of thumb, for example, that might prove a point. Doctors are really bad at managing their own money. So a doctor gets a job, they have huge debt because they've come out of medical school, but they're making a lot of money, so they spend it frivolously. That happens all the time. It's a rule of thumb. It's something that applies to, on the whole, we see examples of it and we kind of project that onto the group. But in a lot of cases, it's true. It's people they're really, really smart people, but they just make bad decisions in this particular area of their life. And maybe it's because they're incapable of processing the idea of managing money. So as we look at information, more information is good, but information overload is a real thing. And it affects people in different ways. And so we try to find ways to process that information in a more efficient manner. So we have rules of thumb. So we become rationally ignorant. And some people hire others to take care of certain aspects of the decision-making process for them. So we hire money managers in the case of some people because it's hard to manage our own money. Now, when we look at information, one of the most classic analyses of information is centered around the idea of asymmetric information. When we talk about asymmetric information, what we're talking about is when in a transaction, one party has information the other doesn't. There's an asymmetry in the available information. And the most classic of all analyses of this is something we call Akerlof's lemons problem. George Akerlof was an economist at UCLA, and he was observing that it is possible that markets could sort of fold in upon themselves, kind of like a black hole collapsing, because of a lack of reliable information. When information isn't available, or it isn't trusted, then that can interrupt the flow of a market. I mean, think about, for example, eBay. It's amazing that eBay works as well as it does because we have buyers and sellers engaged in an auction. They never interact with each other. There's hardly There are rarely instances where we have repeated interactions between buyers and sellers. Yet people trust what's going on in that market, in part because eBay has set up a system where there are refunds, where there are ways of adjudicating any kind of disagreements, and there's a trust that's built up in that. With Akerlof's lemons, one of the problems is a lack of trust. And because of that, a market may not exist at all. It may just collapse, or it may never form to begin with. Or it might be that in a market, in a lemons market, only items of very low quality might be sold. And again, it's a lack of trust that messes the whole thing up. Now, one question to ask here is whether or not this is a market failure, and if it is deemed to be a market failure, do we need government intervention to fix the problem? But before we even consider that, let's take a look at what Akerlof is talking about in the context of the used car market, the example that Akerlof uses, but also a great illustration of when lemons or subpar quality items might be what's being bought and sold. So one of the problems in the lemons market is that bad products end up driving out the good because buyers lack information. That's what we see in the used car market. We see this parking lot full of used cars. And in that lot, we see that there are some good cars and some bad cars, but most buyers aren't going to be able to tell the difference. Most sellers probably know the difference, but don't want to reveal that information to the buyer. As a result of this, there's the potential, the very real potential, that bad cars could be overvalued while good cars are undervalued. So let's think about this from the prospect of buying a used car. Lemons are the cars that are no good. You buy the car, you drive it for a week or two, and then the car stops working, or the radiator goes bad, or the brakes don't work, or something like that. So let's say you have a 50-50 chance of getting the lemon. If a good car is valued at $10,000 and a bad car is valued at $2,000, then we can use an expected value calculation to determine what the market value of the car should be. So let's go ahead and do that. The expected value is 0.5, so that's 50% chance of getting the $10,000 car and a 50% chance of getting the $2,000 car. We multiply 0.5 by 10,000, and that gives us 5,000. We multiply 0.5 times 2,000, and that gives us 1,000. And then we add those two numbers up, and then we get our expected value of the car of $6,000. Now, do you see a problem here? If the expected value is 6,000, but good cars are worth 10, do you think people are going to bring those $10,000 cars to the market if they can only charge $6,000? If that's what consumers are willing to pay, because they may get a good car, they may get a bad car. And if bad cars are worth $2,000, do you think people are going to bring the $6,000 car? Or do you think people are going to bring those cars to the market if they can get $6,000 for them? That's our problem. And that's why the market might go under. If the good cars are worth 10, but the market price is 6, why would you bring that car to the market? You wouldn't. But you would bring the bad cars to the market because they're only worth 2,000 and you can sell them for 6. But if you're the buyer and you know this, or at least you have some rationally ignorant understanding of this process, would you be a buyer in this market, knowing that the good cars probably aren't even going to make it to the market? No, you wouldn't. Because if you're paying $6,000 for a $2,000 car, then you're getting taken by the used car dealer, which is why used car dealers have the reputation that they have. So the price is going to have to fall if there's going to be a market. But then what happens? Well, only the really bad cars come to the market, which means the expected value is going to go down. And then only the really, really bad cars are going to come to the market. So we've got a huge problem here. Customers are risk averse. They don't want to be messing around with the bad used cars. So there's got to be something put in place to try to encourage people to come to the market. You need a way, in other words, for customers to overcome their aversion to the market. And there are ways that this can be done, of course. Maybe not in the case of used cars, but low prices or free samples can get the product into the hands of the customer so they can see if it's okay. This is why you test drive a car. This is why if you go to Costco, there are all these free samples, because consumers aren't sure what they're getting. If they get a free sample and they like it, then maybe they are more likely to purchase a product. Otherwise, they may not may not switch their consumption from one product to another. You can advertise. Again, this is one of the reasons why we see so many car dealers advertise. They talk about their products. They talk about all the value that can be had by buying their product, even if it's a used product. Now, if it's not a used car, you can have an ad campaign that uses famous people. Hey, if Ryan Reynolds uses that product, then I should be able to use that product. If Beyonce uses that product, well, it must be good. Or you can just do a side-by-side comparison of how great your product is versus somebody else's. You can franchise stores. This is a way of sending a signal to your customer base or your potential customer base. If you stop at a McDonald's anywhere in the country, you're almost assured of getting at least the same thing that you bought at any other McDonald's. So you know what you're getting. There's no uncertainty, or the uncertainty is reduced when you buy a Big Mac at McDonald's, because you know what to expect from McDonald's, because the McDonald's franchise is the same anywhere you go. If you pull into a small town, you're not exactly sure where to eat, and there's like a local diner, you're not sure what you're getting beforehand. But a franchise store allows people to kind of take that risk out of the equation. Or you could offer warranties, and this is one of the things that car dealers often do. Hey, you have a warranty. You get your money back if you're not completely satisfied. You can bring the car back within a week and get all of your money back. Or we will have, if something breaks in the first 90 days, then we will fix it free of charge. These are things that are put in place. These are tools that are used to try to help get customers past their risk aversion. Now that brings us to a second problem. That problem is called adverse selection, and this is when the sellers actually lack some information. When the price of a good changes in the market, it causes the highest risk or the worst deals to become part of the sales. In particular, if the price of something goes up, then people who don't really need it or don't really want it, they'll bail out of that market. This is a particularly problematic thing in the insurance market. Think about what happens when the price of health insurance goes up. If you're a healthy young person, you don't want to buy the health insurance. You're like, I don't need that. But if you are someone who is sick or is prone to illness or has a family history of people getting sick, your risk is much higher. And so even at higher prices, you're more likely to buy. This is bad for the insurance company. They need the healthy people to subsidize the unhealthy people. Otherwise, we're spiraling down into a world where the health insurance companies can't afford to continue to provide health insurance for these customers. Life insurance is a similar thing. I bought life insurance, and one of the things that you do when you go through the life insurance process is you take a medical exam. And what is going on there is that the insurance company wants to know, am I a high risk? Because they want to charge me the right price. Otherwise, if they charge everybody a high price, I'm not buying. Yeah, I know I'm going to die one day, but it's not going to be any time in the future. I don't think it will be unless there's an accident, because I'm pretty healthy. Those people who aren't healthy would come into the life insurance market and say, yeah, I'll buy that. They die 6 months later. The life insurance company has to pay out an enormous sum that was not paid for in full by the person who bought the product. So what can happen if only the high-risk people purchase the product is that some consumers are going to be deprived of the chance to buy things, to buy insurance, because the price is too high. And the seller ends up selling to basically bad risk people, which means their costs go through the roof. Now, this would not be a problem if information about the riskiness of the consumer was known to the seller. So in the insurance industry, there are lots of things that are put in place to try to fix the adverse selection process. Pre-screenings, for example. You've got to get an exam. As I mentioned, the health exam for life insurance. One of the things that they're checking for is whether you're a smoker, because you can lie on the form, oh, I'm not a smoker, but the blood tests that they take will tell if there's nicotine in your blood, and they will charge you a much higher rate if you're a smoker. Why? Because, well, you're likely to die sooner, or you're likely to have worse health if you're a smoker, and they're going to charge you more for this. They look at the sex of the person. This is, a rule of thumb. Women are less risky in a lot of different ways. So women get better rates on things like car insurance and life insurance and health insurance. Well, car insurance and life insurance, to be sure. There are ways to fix the insurance problem on the case of, say, auto insurance by putting a rule in place, a law in place that says you have to have car insurance if you're going to drive a car. This keeps down the cost of the insurance companies, because now the safe drivers are subsidizing the ones who aren't all that safe. So everybody has to buy the insurance. And if we think about Obamacare, this is basically why the mandate that everybody had to buy insurance was put into the law, because they needed the young, healthy people to subsidize the older people or the sicker people. That part has been stripped out of the law, which makes the law not all that effective. But that's why it was there in the first place, was because there is an adverse selection in the purchase of some things. There's a lack of information on the part of the sellers, where only the worst risks would buy their product, but the seller may not know that. It's an adverse selection. So how do we solve the information problem? Well, part of the way we solve the information problem depends in part upon what kind of market we're dealing with, what kind of market structure. So if buyers and sellers know the true quality, if they know the true price, if they know everything, then we have perfectly competitive markets, and things are settled pretty easily and pretty smoothly. The prices of products reflect the complete information of the buyers and the sellers. But if neither the product nor the buyer knows anything about the quality, then things are a little bit different. What we end up seeing is something similar to perfect competition, but for a different reason. So because nobody knows anything about the true quality of a product, the product gets sold for its expected value. Basically, here, neither side knows they're getting a bad deal. And so if they get a bad deal, it's not on purpose. It's not like there's some kind of subterfuge here. And the expected value persists in the marketplace. Another thing is we could require the sharing of information. It may be costly for one of the parties to gather information the other party already has. And so there may be rules or laws or constraints put in place to require the sharing of information. But we have to be a little bit careful about that. If somebody has information the other party doesn't, because they've researched things, because they've worked hard at collecting the information, it doesn't mean that we need to take away that advantage. This is what you see here. The picture here is what's called a blue-gray crock. It's an antique jug, basically. They come in different sizes. They come with different designs on them, and some of them are incredibly valuable. My father-in-law is an expert in these kinds of things, and this particular type of antique. He knows his crocks. He was driving down a street one day in a town and came to a stop sign and looked over at the house that was on the corner and saw one of these on the porch of the house. So he pulled over, got out of his car, went up to the door and knocked on the door and asked the person who came to the door if they would be willing to sell it to him. And he offered them like $100. They were shocked. They'd been keeping umbrellas in it. They were shocked, and they were more than happy to take the money. And he was more than happy to take the crock off their hands and then resell it for about $800. He has the information about how valuable this is. And if he was required to share that information, then there wouldn't be any incentive for him to become an expert in that particular area. So should we require the sharing of information? Maybe. And maybe not. If you bear the burden of becoming informed, then you should reap the rewards for that. But there are some things perhaps that it makes sense to actually disclose. For example, there are lots of disclosure laws when it comes to buying a house. You have to disclose if there's been water damage. You have to disclose if there's been fire damage. There are certain things that it would just be really, really costly for the buyer to become informed on. So it's the burden of the seller to release that information. And if they don't, then the sale can be rescinded. There are disclosure laws about some things, but not about everything. Of course, one of the best ways to deal with the information problem is just to have repeated interactions with people. Now, this isn't always possible. Clearly, when we buy a house, we're not going to have repeated interaction with the same person. Maybe when we buy a car, we go back to the same dealer over and over because there's some trust that's built up there. There's repeated interactions. And so if somebody stiffs you the first time, you say, well, I'm not going back to them. But if someone treats you well and provides you with information about a product the first time, then you do go back to that person. Now, there's one other kind of interesting area here when it comes to information. It's something we call moral hazard. Now, it's easy to get moral hazard and adverse selection kind of mixed up. What we're talking about with moral hazard is not that someone is going to buy a product because they're a high risk. This is that's kind of happens before the purchase. Moral hazard occurs after the purchase. This is when people act carelessly because they will be compensated for accidents. So a great example of a moral hazard is the banking industry. If banks are considered too big to fail, then they might engage in riskier activities knowing that they will be bailed out if they screw up. That's one of the big concerns that we have about bailing out industries that make bad decisions but are deemed to be too important. Of course, this can happen with other things as well. If you have insurance, you might end up going to the emergency room because you have a cold or a hangnail or something like that, because the insurance covers you. So you have this insurance and now you're acting in a careless way because, well, I don't have to worry about paying for it. You might drive faster because you think that your car is super safe. You've got airbags all over the place. You've got the seat belts will keep you safe. In fact, there's interesting research that shows that people do drive more recklessly, or at least faster, because of all the safety features they think they have. Now, one way to deal with this is that companies put in place deductibles and co-payments so that if you do go to the ER for a cold, you do have to pay something, and typically it's more than what you would pay if you just went to the doctor's office. If you wreck your car because you've driven too fast, you have to pay a certain amount of money before the insurance company will repair your car. So deductibles and copays can help with this problem, but they won't make it go away entirely. There are also things that can help companies know more information, or individuals know more information without being too costly to establish. Asymmetric information poses a problem, but if we can have people send signals to the buyers and the sellers about their trustworthiness, about their honesty, then that can be a significant step towards overcoming the asymmetric information problem. So sellers will try to target their audiences with signals of quality. One of those signals is the Better Business Bureau. Hey, we are approved by the Better Business Bureau. We're bonded by the Better Business Bureau. Or some other third party that verifies the trustworthiness of a company. But the signal does need to be reliable. If you don't trust the Better Business Bureau, or if you don't trust Angie's List or one of these online companies, then it really doesn't matter. But sending signals is one thing. Establishing a reputation is another sort of a signal. But you have to be around a while to establish that reputation. You can, if you're the seller, say the seller of labor, then you can target your employer. You provide references and work histories, and you provide them a resume. This is sending a signal to your potential employer that you're a good worker. Screening, on the other hand, is kind of if you're searching for something and you want to be able to reduce the number of choices. You want to look out there and see what you have to choose from and reduce the noise, reduce the, just all of the buzz that's out there, and try to target something that's important. And so basically what you're trying to do is get people to reveal things to you. So as the buyer of something, you have interviews, you search through resumes. If you are if you're online looking for someone to date, people have to post pictures or post what do they like. It's a screening process. It's a way to sort through all of the possible things out there. Of course, the problem with online dating, though, is that sometimes those pictures aren't really reliable, and that poses a significant problem. The last thing I want to talk about here deals with advertising. Advertising, as I referred to a little bit earlier, is a way to try to transmit information. And there are really two views of advertising. One is that advertising is trying to share information, and thereby it's trying to help consumers and helping them to make better choices. The other approach to advertising, the other way we think about advertising, is that it's really just trying to shift the demand curve to get people to buy your product because they want something that is, that is coming in that shiny package of advertising. So as an advertiser, you're trying to persuade the customers so that they come and buy more of your products. Advertising doesn't happen all that much in perfect competition or monopoly. There's no reason to advertise in those areas because in perfect competition, everybody's selling exactly the same thing. In monopoly, there's only one seller. So there's no advantage. If I put an advertisement on television or on the radio or on a website in a perfectly competitive market, I'm really just advertising the product, not my product. So people go out and buy it from somebody else, and it's just a cost to me. In monopoly, there's only the one seller, so you don't need to advertise other than to alert the customers that you have a product. And then they come and buy it from you, but once they know the product exists, there's no reason to go and advertise. Where we see advertising is in monopolistic competition and in oligopoly, where there's product differentiation and there are multiple sellers. But advertising is a cost too. Advertising can be extremely expensive. Firms spend millions of dollars on advertising. They spend billions of dollars in advertising in the United States every year. And it could be that there is a payoff, but it could be that there's no payoff. It could actually put you in a prisoner's dilemma. So let's take a look at the prisoner's dilemma of advertising.
Okay, let's take a look at some game theory here to help us understand why firms advertise. So we'll draw out our matrix here. And we're going to have two firms. Firm 1 over here we'll call Pepsi. And firm 2 up top here we'll call Coke. Everybody knows about Pepsi and Coke. So the question is, why do they advertise so much? Well, in this game, they can either advertise, that's one strategy, or not advertise. If Coke advertises and Pepsi advertises, Coke's going to get 2,000. If Pepsi advertises and Coke advertises, Pepsi's going to get 2,000 and Coke's going to get 2,000. If neither firm advertises, Pepsi's going to get 4,000 and Coke's going to get 4,000. The reason the payoffs are larger if you don't advertise is because you don't have the huge costs of advertising. You still have your customer base, they still know about your product, but they just don't see you on TV anymore. Clearly, between these two options, it's more profitable for the two firms to not advertise. Yet they advertise, and they advertise a lot. Why is that? Well, let's take a look at the off diagonals. In the northeast box, if Pepsi advertises but Coke doesn't, then what we see is that Pepsi gets 6,000. They take some of Coke's customers, and Coke only gets 500. So advertising is important, and it does attract new customer base. So there's an incentive here to advertise. Now, in the southwest corner, we see exactly why the firms decide to advertise. Because in the southwest corner, if Pepsi's not advertising while Coke is, Pepsi gets 500 and Coke gets the 6,000. The outcome of the game is counterintuitive because each firm has a dominant strategy. Look what happens if Pepsi advertises. If they choose to advertise, they will either get 2,000, which is better than 500 if they don't, or they'll get 6,000, which is better than 4,000 if they don't. So here we see that Pepsi has a dominant strategy to advertise. Coke has a similar dominant strategy. If Coke says we're going to advertise no matter what, then depending on what happens with Pepsi, they will either get 2,000, which is better than 500, or they'll get 6,000, which is better than 400, or 4,000. So Coke has a dominant strategy to advertise, which puts us in this suboptimal box. Basically what we have is a situation where you could be down here, which is preferred, but you're not going to get there. You're going to be in the suboptimal box because this is a prisoner's dilemma. It's a prisoner's dilemma game. This is why firms, some firms at least, advertise so much more than they probably should, because they're worried that they can't trust their adversary to hold to a bargain of not advertising.
So of course we want to know, with all the money that's spent on advertising, does it work? Well, sometimes it's just noise. Sometimes it's just putting people on television. Sometimes it actually increases prices because costs of the product go up. But sometimes it does decrease prices. And the classic example of price decreases is in eyeglasses. It used to be illegal to advertise eyeglasses anywhere, really. The thought was this is just going to increase the price of glasses for consumers, and that's no fair. But remarkably, when some advertising was allowed, it actually reduced the prices considerably because consumers knew that they had options and they could go shop shop at competitors for their glasses. They didn't have to just buy them from the eye doctor. And so eyeglasses, even though they're kind of expensive, you have options. You can go and search around and find, take your prescription from your eye doctor with you to other places to buy eyeglasses cheaper. When it comes to advertising, there are three types of goods that are advertised. One are what we call search goods. These are goods that a consumer can establish, where the consumer can establish the quality before they make the purchase. So you can see the quality in front of you. You don't even have to try the product before you can establish the quality. The second type of good is what we call an experience good. This is where you have to actually use the thing before you can determine the quality. So this might be something you have to taste before you are sure that it's any good. It might be something that you have to maybe ride in a car. The third type of good is what we call credence goods. Credence goods they're the tricky ones. Those are the goods where you can't determine the quality even after you've consumed it. You're not exactly sure whether it's any good or not. So this would be something like going to your mechanic. Maybe they fixed the problem, maybe they didn't. Maybe they did a good job and maybe they didn't. It's hard for most of us to know. Or when you have surgery, maybe somebody did a really terrible job and got lucky and you just don't know. Credence goods are tough because you don't know if you've got a good deal or not. So let me ask you a quick question here about these three types of goods. As you see it, which of the following would describe clothing? Would it be a search good where you can establish the quality before you buy? Would it be an experience good that you have to experience once before you know whether it's any good? Would you consider it an experience good in the sense that you have to wear it many times before you know? Or would you consider it a credence good, where you really don't know the quality even after you've worn it many times? How would you see clothing? Just take a second and think about that. Well, clothing probably is not a credence good. Once you've worn something, you can probably tell. But after that, it's a little bit hard to determine. It might be something that it might be coming from a brand that you know very well, and so you can establish the quality. You say, "Oh, that's a pair of Levi's jeans. I know what the quality is. I don't have to try that one at all. I know what I'm getting." Or something that somebody has told you about. Maybe it's an experience good where you have to just try it on once and oh no, this is great. This is high quality. Or maybe it's something you look at and you've had in your drawer for a couple of years and you're like, wow, that has really held up well. So not everything that we buy is going to fit neatly into one of these categories. But we can place things into these categories very generally, or at least eliminate one of the categories. So let's take a look real quickly here at types of advertising. Advertising can be informational, where it describes the product's characteristics. It's giving the potential consumer some more information about whether it's good or not. It can be persuasive, which are designed to try to shift consumers' tastes. Hey, this product over here, this is way better, and here are the characteristics that make it way better than this product over here. So, buy Coca-Cola because it's so much better than Pepsi. Interestingly, when it comes to advertising lotteries, most states are not supposed to use persuasive advertising. They're not trying to persuade you to become a gambler. So persuasive ads do have some limitations on them. But these are the primary types of advertising. Now, the result of advertising is, from an economic, kind of the pure economics point of view, is trying to just shift the demand curve. And if you're successful, you can increase profits on existing units. We'll see this in the graph coming up here in just a second in area A. And if you're successful at this and you shift the demand curve, you can increase sales, which would generate new profits on new units of goods sold. That will be our areas B and C. In our analysis here, what we're going to see is that there's an increase in price, but we have to keep in mind that all of these benefits have to be measured against the costs of advertising. So here we have, over here, just the normal market before advertising. and the firm finds where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. They produce Q1 units of output. They charge P as the price, so we'll just call this P1. So in this market where there is some market power, this would be the firm making their pricing and quantity decisions, pricing and output decisions. But if advertising is successful, then we shift the demand curve out from the black line to the blue line. When you shift the demand curve, you also shift the marginal revenue curve. So you're shifting from MR to MR prime, which means you're going to find a new intersection, a new marginal revenue, marginal cost line. And notice our marginal cost is just constant here, just for simplicity. When you find that new marginal revenue, marginal cost intersection, you go down to the quantity axis. You will now produce Q2 to maximize profits. You go up to the demand curve and across, and now your price is P prime or P2. This is your new price. It's higher than the original price. So we see that in this case, at least, price has gone up. Now, because you're selling to everybody at the same price, you get area A as additional profit for the first units that you sold. So here at this point, here's Q1, but now you're selling Q1 at a higher price. So you gain profits on all of those original units, and then you also sell more output as you go from Q1 to Q2. So you get area B and area C, all this green box here, that's new profits for you as the firm. That's what advertising is supposed to do. Now let me test your knowledge real quickly here on advertising. What's your view about small amounts of advertising? Say that a local restaurant buys 3 30-second ads on a local newscast. Do you say that this is going to have a large effect? Do you say that this small amount will have some effect? Will you say that this small amount will have no measurable change in sales? Or would you say that this small amount will only cost the firm and provide absolutely no benefit? What do you think about this? Well, of course, any of these options could be the case. Part of it depends on when the advertisements are played. Are they played in the middle of the night? Are they played during rush hour? So the small amount of ads could have a huge effect. It could have a small effect. It might have no effect. But really what I want to pay attention to now as we wrap up this information economics lesson is this part right here. What about the cost? We haven't talked about the cost much. When we look at when we looked at advertising, one of the things that we saw here was reflected in the marginal revenue of advertising. We saw that marginal revenue shifted out because of successful advertising. But if we were to take the marginal revenue from advertising and plot it out, we might see a different story. But there are what we call threshold effects, where there are little or no effects from very small amounts of advertising. At least the marginal revenue doesn't go up very much. But those small impacts are followed by increasing returns. So the more you advertise, the bigger the return. But there is the possibility that you overdo it, and then it just becomes a cost because there's not much additional revenue being generated through all of this massive amount of advertising. That would look kind of like this. Here's our graph where initially, if we have the amount of advertising on our horizontal axis and the marginal revenue is this line, initially there's not a whole lot of feedback or impact from the advertising itself. But then we see that the curve starts to increase and increase more steeply. These are the increasing returns until we max out our marginal revenue. And then there are the decreasing returns where people just see the advertisement so often and they just kind of ignore it. But you still have to pay for it. It's kind of like the insurance ads that we see over and over and over, and we see so much of. Perhaps those ads don't have the impact that they had initially, and maybe they're actually causing marginal revenues to decline. And if people just get totally sick of it, we can clearly see here that marginal revenue is now negative. If we put a cost curve in with that, we can see that firms can make the decision about how much to advertise based on the marginal revenue, marginal cost comparisons. The cost of advertising, the marginal cost at least, slopes down at first. And clearly there are economies of scale per message that you put out there. But are there economies of scale per sale? The answer might be yes if the advertising expands sales sufficiently. So when we talk about the cost response, we can look at this in terms of marginal revenue and marginal cost and finding the best output. So when firms are making decisions about advertising, they could just look at the marginal revenue and marginal cost from the advertising and find out what's the best level to advertise. Here we see the marginal cost curve sloping downward along the amount of advertising. And here's our marginal revenue curve that we saw from our last slide. There are 2 points where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Here at advertising level A, the firm has marginal revenue equal marginal cost, but after that, the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost, so it makes sense to continue to increase advertising up until you get to point B, where after that, the marginal revenue curve falls below the marginal cost curve. So that's about it for information economics. Information economics is a course in and of itself, but this is just a nice introduction to that topic. So information is important, it clearly is important, and our economy is becoming more information-based. So this part of microeconomics is likely to become more and more important in our understanding of microeconomic theory. How does information affect our decisions, but also how does producing information and changing the scope of our production affect just all of the economic decisions that we make, and how does it change our analysis of economic interactions between people? That's sort of something that we're going to have to pay more attention to in the future as economists.